Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the After Show here at WYCC.org.
Joining us are Amin Hartman, publisher of Indigo, Dean Richards, film critic and entertainment reporter for WGN-TV, and Natalie Moore, reporter for WBEZ Radio. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'd like to talk a little bit about CPS, Chicago Public Schools. There are 129 schools now in the crosshairs listed as underutilized, and most of those schools are in the south and west sides of the city. They are minority neighborhoods largely. They are financially disadvantaged neighborhoods largely. And the question has been raised as to whether or not these closings are racially biased. Are your thoughts?
They're absolutely racially biased. They're racist. All of the schools, they're not in minorities, they are in African American neighborhoods. And there is a pattern, and the pattern is the poorer the neighborhood, the more schools are closing. If you're going to close schools in Chicago, you need to look at the whole of the city. You can't just look at African Americans, you can't just look at a certain sector and say we're going to do this across the board. I think that's a real consideration, and I don't think there's any getting around it. But the other thing is, how many schools are you going to close? We've heard 300 was on the list, now it's 129, and to just have mass school closing at a time when the violence in this city is just gone, off the chain berserk, I think it's a dangerous thing.
At the same time, you have a huge budget crisis facing the Chicago Public Schools, and you have many of these classrooms are empty because there aren't enough kids. So what is the school district to do?
These are also important neighborhoods, which we need to point out as well. And at WBEZ, one of our web people did an overlay map of the potential schools that were going to close with vacant lots and blight. And so these are neighborhoods that are already under-resourced, and the CPS is saying, oh, we'll do something else with those school buildings. What are you going to do with an empty school building that's already surrounded by empty lots and other vacant buildings? And with as far as the budget goes, the other question is what is underutilized really mean? If policymakers are telling us, education experts, that smaller class sizes are the way to go, then why is it a bad thing if there are smaller classrooms with the number of pupils in some of these schools?
And I'm certainly, no expert on the school system as a film critic, but as somebody who went to public school, I certainly recall resources not being used properly in the schools. And I think that may be more prevalent today than ever before. We're talking about a limited number of dollars which are available to operate the schools. And I couldn't agree more about the resources that are needed to get kids off the streets in these days where we're talking about violence and gangs and all of the problems that we're talking about, not just in Chicago, but all over the country. It would seem like anything that you can do to reorganize, that the mayor and the school board need to really take a look and reorganize to get some programs that are keeping the kids busy.
You talked about the violence. I mean, there was a concerted effort not to put any high schools on this endangered schools list because they were fearful that people may have to cross gang lines to get to different high schools and relocate, and that could be dangerous. Is it odd then to have middle schoolers and elementary schoolers crossing those same boundaries?
It's even more so because they're younger, okay? And I think the threat is probably even greater for the kids. I don't think a wholeness of a plan has been presented to the Chicago public, and the wholeness of the plan is, yes, you're going to close 4 schools in one area, but of the 4 that you close, what happens to them? Are those going to be empty buildings that become gang, drug-infested, or are they going to become safe havens? Or how are those schools and those buildings going to be utilized? We're going to sell them off? Is Bloomberg going to come?
Because the abandoned schools right now, we know, are magnets for drugs and gangs, and there are many of them in the city.
So what's going to happen to those? Maybe Bloomberg will come and buy them, take them to New York or something.
And
everybody's down on Bloomberg.
I'm not down on him.
Seems to care about Chicago these days, doesn't he?
I'm sorry he's not doing newspaper ads rather than all the TV stuff.
And transferring students to different schools is very disruptive, and it can set a child behind too. So outside of the physicality of school closing, it's also what is the impact and the safety, just the educational component about having students transfer to different schools and being in a new environment.
A lot to discuss here, and we thank you, our panel, for joining us today, and we'd like to thank our viewers. We'll see you next week.